So I'm going to welcome everyone to NTGPE hosted webinar on transition. For those of you who have children, we might be able to call it, Are We There Yet? And hopefully we're getting close. I'm Jenny Davis. I'm the lead medical educator for Supervisor and Practice Accreditation with NTGPE, but I'm also a supervisor and a medical educator. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we're all meeting tonight, and to pay our respects to the elders past and present. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the deep and enduring connection to land, waters and seas. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us tonight. And I feel it would be remiss not to acknowledge the vast contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to that have made and are continuing to make to general practice training around Australia. So tonight is about trying to ensure that transition to college-led training goes smoothly, at least hopefully only with a few speed humps along the way. Our goal is to help demystify the coming changes, and our format is to have a short presentation from both RACGP and from ACRRRM, and then to enjoy some time for some questions. So please, as we're going, type your questions into the chat box and we'll ask those questions after the presentations. As a little bit of housekeeping, I would like to just remind you that the session is being recorded and that everyone is muted to try and reduce the background noise. So I'd like to now hand over to our college representatives. And from RACGP, we have Dr. Gerard Ingham, Dr. Karin Jodlowski-Tan, Mr. David Glasson, and I'm not sure if Mr. Glen Wallace is on yet or not. From ACRRRM, we have representatives of Dr. Vimbai Kapuya, who may well be known to many of you in the NT, and Ms. Roberta Morris and Ms. Sandra Johanson. I'd also first like to introduce Dr. Kaylee Davie. Kaylee is actually our NT Supervisor Liaison Officer. She's presently in Vimbai and she's actually going to be facilitating tonight's discussions. So I'm going to hand over to Kaylee at this point. Thanks, Kaylee.
No worries. Nice to see you all, virtually at least. So I think we'll just kick off starting with the RACGP presentation, which I think should be coming up next. Yeah, that's it. So I'll hand over to RACGP to commence. So I think, as Jenny said, we've got 15 minutes for RACGP and then 15 minutes for ACRRRM and then some time for questions. So take it away, RACGP.
So yeah, Gerard Ingham here. I'll do the presenting on behalf of the RACGP, but Glen Wallace isn't here tonight. But also Tony Saltis, who's is joining us, who's also has the same position as me. He's the Senior Medical Advisor for Supervisor Professional Development, and along with Karin Jodlowski-Tan, National Clinical Leader and for Rural, and David Glasson. I keep forgetting what your title is, but that's all right, David. You're very important. Let's go on to the next slide, if we could. Thank you. So basically, if we talked about, what I want to give you in a nutshell, what our message is really the RACGP didn't ask to take over training. In fact, it was very happy with how the RTOs were running, and we certainly know and deeply respect the great work that NTGPE has done for a long, long time, and know they're running an excellent program, and particularly a program that they have deep knowledge of. It's not like you can run the same program that you run in Tasmania or New South Wales, that you can go ahead and run that in the NT. So we already know that they're running excellent programs, and the same is pretty much true of all 9 regional training organisation programs. So the RACGP's philosophy is basically aiming for business as usual wherever and whenever possible. However, there are 9 different programs, so it's not possible to have them all running the same. So we've had to make some decisions. There are some things which are different, but also as far as possible, whenever we can, we're choosing to run exactly the same as what's been running currently. Next slide, thanks. In terms of making this happen, the RACGPs, I mean, I'm old enough to be there when the college had training and lost it to the RTOs all those years ago. And remember, one of the main reasons was because decisions were being made in Melbourne or being made a long way away from where the training delivery was had, and it was disconnected. The National College was disconnected from the delivery. So it's purposely this time designed how things will be delivered as a very distributed model. So not only will education happen you know, in the regions and locally, but decisions will be made about how it's delivered locally, and that's only the right way for it to happen. It sort of makes sense in terms of achieving that delivery. And you can see that nearly all the staff will be employed in local and regional areas. Only a very small amount in national areas will be sort of broader policy development and IT and finance and such like, but most of the actual delivery and decisions about education. And that might be a little bit frustrating for you tonight, because sometimes you'll ask me questions, or ask any of us questions, and we'll say, oh, well, that'll depend upon what the Northern Territory medical educators, RACGP medical educators think about what's the best way to deliver it, because it's not really for me, sitting as I am in rural Victoria, to make decisions about how things should happen in NT. But broadly, it's aiming to be business as usual. If we move on to the next slide, having for supervisors, if the message is to supervisors and practices, really most of the changes is not well, hardly any change is going to happen in the practice. Everything's happening where it is happening is further afield from you. So what you do as a supervisor, providing your clinical oversight, responding to ad hoc requests for help, your teaching, your assessing, and providing that support which you do so well for registrars, that remains your responsibility. There's not going to be any more fingers into what you're doing in your practice. Each practice is respected as as an academic place where education happens, and we'll want you to keep on doing what you're doing. Next slide, please. In terms of placements and matching, as you know, the allocation of placements for 2023, that's really the responsibility of NTGPE, and that's gone and progressed without and that's already, I'm understanding that's in the process at the moment and being finalised, and that NTGPE will doing that. If you're asking, well, what will RACGP do, and I did see one of the pre-asked questions was asking about what will happen in terms of placement policies and whatever in the future. For example, I understand that the NT's sort of mandatory remote placement policy. Really, everything will continue as it is next year. Beyond that, I mean, we won't guarantee that there won't be any change in the future, but we'll sit down and understand why things are designed the way they are, and wouldn't be doing anything differently without there being a very good reason to do something differently. And the decisions, as I said earlier, will not be made solely by someone sitting in another state. They'll be made in the NT about how things work. So there might be a nationally consistent process, but I'm sure it'll have its variation into how it works in the NT. Going forward broadly in pretty much all areas, the aim is to have a small excess of available placements to registrar numbers so that you can make sure each registrar gets matched. Where there's a priority placement where people need to get their RG education done, or there's other reasons why they need to be placed, they'll be matched first. And then in general, the broader principle is that it's registrar and practice preferences, and try to match them up where you can. Next slide. Accreditation, so all NTGPE training practices will retain their accreditation. One thing which is a bit different, I don't think the NT has, so around the country there's some regions that have what's called primary and secondary supervisors, or main supervisor and secondary supervisor. So the RACGP has adopted that model. So every registrar has to have a primary supervisor. That's the person who's responsible for all of their training and education. But, when that primary supervisor is not available, or when someone else wants to do some teaching, so maybe someone who's available to I do supervising on a Wednesday afternoon, or I'm do that teaching session. I like to teach about skin excisions. That person will become accredited as a secondary supervisor. We believe that's a way of trying to get the people who are a little bit interested, but not fully interested to get them in the door, and hopefully we'll grow them into primary supervisors in the future. So all NT supervisors, current ones who've completed their foundation workshops, will become primary supervisors with RACGP, but in future they'll be able to elect to train us either as primary or secondary. So that's a little change, not currently, but into the future. Next slide, please. The teaching requirements, so the RACGP standards are being applied, and they're just a little, the teaching is a little bit different from what's currently required in the NT. I'll put it there. In GPT-1, there's no change. That's 3 hours with 1 hour must be uninterrupted. In GPT-2, it's different. There's a reduction in time. See, NTGPE currently has 2 hours per week, 1 hour uninterrupted, and you can see that change. And there's 1 hour a fortnight for GPT-3, whereas NTGPE currently has 1 hour per week. We're not, these are minimum teaching requirements. We encourage you to keep going with your excellent teaching that you're providing. I just want to briefly mention that group teaching is allowed, but that shouldn't be the predominant method. Obviously, registrars need to their assessments and their individual teaching to respond to their individual learning needs to happen. Next slide, thank you. There is a change to the teaching payment, but the national consistent payment is for both RACGP and ACRRM registrars across the country. It's the same payment in all places. The teaching payment, as you can see, particularly it's more generous for those of us who, like myself, in MMM5 or beyond, like some of you will be, and that will make a significant difference. And particularly, you'll notice there that there's now a payment for teaching in GPT-3, which there wasn't before. That'll be paid monthly in arrears. For those of you who are on the GPSA conference last night, there was a bit more detail, which I'm happy to answer later about. And maybe David will probably have an even greater idea than me about, how you register with the organisation register and make sure that those payments happen. And there is a possibility currently, though I'd be surprised if many practices choose it, to have supervisors paid individually rather than supervisors paid through the practice. We imagine that facility was set up particularly with the remote supervision in mind. If we move on to the next slide. In terms of the practice payment, again, there's an improved practice payment. It's this will be not only improvement, but also an improvement, the fact that it's paid quarterly in advance. There won't be any documentation payment. I think David may be able to speak a little bit to this as well, in terms of there are the sort of practice support payments support payments for registrars who are going into more difficult and challenging to places. They'll be funded through a separate program called the flexible support payments, and I think that's still being worked out as we speak. Next slide. Just to mention that there some supervisors in the past have said, well, what do I teach? And in some regions, there's actually supervisors use a curriculum and go through. There's a system called GP365 used in South Australia and Western Australia. I don't think in the NT. But if you haven't looked at it as yet, the RACGP has developed some new resources, its curriculum and syllabus. If you go to the web page and click through, there's some, for those of you who do like to do some topic teaching, some very useful resources for use with the supervisor, and the learning resources there are very up to date. If you've suddenly got a registrar ask you a curly question and you're not sure what the latest is on that area, you can generally find it in the curriculum. And we'll also be encouraging practices, so it's not mandatory to have an in-practice teaching plan. So basically structuring out your teaching as about when you're going to do it, when you're going to add in your assessments, when you're going to do various things. Next slide, please. In terms of supervisor PD, I think, again, we have a vision of where we would like to move towards as sort of local small group peer meetings. Speaking the other week to Jenny, and I think probably it's fair to say that it'll continue to run fairly similar to how you run it currently. You've got a bit of a travelling roadshow and to run into local small groups, and that's what we're trying to do, is to encourage small groups and learning from each other. The wisdom's often to be shared. What will be better will be that all supervisor PD activities will automatically be CPD accredited. And want to point out, because we're going through this transition time, there isn't any mandated minimum supervisor PD requirements in 2023 to maintain accreditation. All existing supervisors will just need to familiarise themselves with the RACGP way of doing things for us to remain accredited with us, but no other sort of particularly minimum hours. Next slide. New supervisors, we have developed well, first of all, to say it's become mandatory for supervisors all around Australia to complete cultural awareness education before they'll be accepted as a new supervisor, or need to demonstrate that they've completed it in recent times. There is a Foundations of GP Supervision course which the RACGP has developed with others, and we've shared that with ACRRRM, and that's they're intending to implement that as well, which is great news, so that supervisors could complete professional development for both colleges at the same time. And it's based on a national curriculum for GP supervisors, which was developed by one of the other regional training organisations, EVGPT. And so that means that supervisors all around the country will be getting, similar basic foundational education. These modules, when they become available in GP Learning later this year, early next year, will be available to existing supervisors, and that'll be an opportunity for you to familiarise yourself with the so-called core fundamentals again. Next slide.
I'm giving you a 3-minute warning.
3-minute, well, I've got it covered. There's going to be a slightly different training management system called G Prime, which will be different from what you currently have. But like I've just heard, I think they've had the testing of it today, and I've heard that it's very intuitive, very easy to use, and basically for supervisors, for practices, I'm imagining that's where you, well, I know that's where you'll go on to create your practice profile and whatever for matching. For supervisors, it's where you'll go on and do your assessments, complete your assessments, and you can look in at your registrar record, the ECTV reports and such like. Next slide. There will be, there's an early assessment of safety and learning for GPT-1. Next year, again, we in line with this softly start. This is a recommended process for GPT-1, but won't be mandatory. The first assessment you'll need to do as an RACGP supervisor will be a midterm assessment, so probably April, May next year, nothing to do prior to then, and then an end of term assessment. We'll gradually roll out an assessment program over years. Again, we're trying to, as we've got the message, we're trying to not make any barriers or extra burdens when you're learning new systems. I won't speak to the rest of that. We'll just go on to the next slide. In terms of how would we like you to start, there's a lot of evidence out there, and I know that you've been involved in workshops run by Justin Coleman and such like recently, talking about how the stressful time for registrars starting out, particularly starting out remotely, a very challenging time. We're keen that registrars have a safe start, and the registrars value seeing their supervisors consulting, knowing when to call, and feeling that their supervisor is approachable and available. Next slide. So the RACGP recommends, and this is not going to be something which you're expected to deliver next year, but hopefully this is where, if you want to know where we're heading, we're recommending that there'll be a clear orientation plan. There's a checklist. You'll commence with the registrar observing the supervisor. You'll observe at least 4 registrar consultations. And this is the bit which is a little bit different. You'll review all early consultations until you are confident a registrar is safe to practice. And you might do that by going through the notes with them at the end of the day, or for the ones where you weren't called in. That would probably be the most common way that it was done. And once you're safe that they're practice without routine review, you sign them off, and then they really should have a supervision plan. We've got a RACGP, we have a supervision plan document, and it's linked in with the call for help list, which identifies the 80 or so common and important problems where a registrar should call their supervisor. And then you would, at the completion of that, submit your component of the early assessment of safety and learning assessment. I think that might be the last slide. If you go to the next one. Yeah, there we go. I'm done. 1 minute long, sorry. I'll put the questions off until after the ACRRRM. Will we do that, or you choose?
We can't hear you, Kaylee.
Sorry, Kaylee, we're not able to hear you. So we might have questions at the end, actually. So please start writing away into the chat box, and while Kaylee fixes her audio, Vimbai and Roberta and Sandra, would you like to take over from here?
Yes, thanks, Jenny.
Sorry,
So
they're
just
the remainder.
to
You can
know when
flick
you-
through those. Sorry, they were, if they might have been needed, but they're not. And obviously pointing out we've been working with ACRRM.
Thanks, Gerard. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And look, thank you very much for the supervisors and practice managers who are here tonight, coming out after a busy day at work. We really appreciate this opportunity to share how ACRRRM is moving in the space of transition to college-led training. Some of what you will hear from us will be very similar to what Gerard's just told you, and then some will be a little bit different with ACRRRM. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'd firstly like to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of the nation, and we respect the traditional owners of the lands across Australia in which all of our members and staff work and live, and pay respect to their elders past, present and future. Sandra and I are going to be doing this jointly, so I'm going to hand over to Sandra at the moment.
Thank you very much. A hard act to follow, Gerard. I feel like you've covered everything that I want to go through, but very eloquently, so thank you. And just to reiterate what Gerard said there, RACGP and ACRRRM are working closely together in this space so that we're not additional burdens on practices and supervisors in this space, that there is a collaborative approach around professional development and how we implement the programme. So just want to reiterate that. But again, a very, very similar model to RACGP, and recognising the wonderful work that's actually occurred in the Northern Territory and the support that's being provided for registrars through that training. And we want to continue that in this space. And as you know, Dr. Vimbai Kapuya is our Regional Director of Training as well. So if Vimbai wants to jump in, and I think we've got Dr. Rael Codron, who's actually one of our supervisors and medical educators in the Northern Territory. So if at any point you want to jump in, and feel free to do so. But just to let you know that really ACRRRM is a very similar model. Again, has the national aspect, the regional aspect, and the very local aspect, which is where national operations will occur to maintain consistency across the programs on our standards, curriculum. The delivery of, I suppose, our operations will actually stem from that national program. But again, locally and regionally and locally is where those supports will be, and that will guide how our program will actually run from the local context within the teaching practices, the teaching posts within the Northern Territory. And like I say, Gerard's already articulated that very well, so I'll not go into all of the detail. Thanks very much, Roberta.
Next slide.
Yes, thank you. So this slide actually lays out the different functions, which again, what I've said is, the functions around policy and standards will come from a national perspective. The case management and the workforce planning, capacity building will actually come from the regional team, Roberta being the training network coordinator, and that's where that will sit. The placement matching will actually sit within the regions and working with the team with that. And the functions very locally is teaching and coaching and practices, that mentoring, obviously that clinical supervision and assessments. Thanks very much, Roberta.
Next slide.
Thank you. All right, this kind of lays it out. So the practice being in the middle and the registrar and supervisor sitting around that, which basically shows you the supports that we're putting in place. And you see that cultural education and professional development actually is intrinsic for across that. And standardized payments, specialized practice support. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading this out because you can very clearly see how this is mapped through, but the supporting network roles that we will have in each of our regions with Roberta and the team there are to provide that on the ground support for practices in supporting the registrars, and some of the key roles that we will have in place will be the rural practice support officers and the supervisor liaison officers who will work closely with the practices to provide that support. Thank you, Roberta.
Next slide.
Thank you. All right. Oops, can't see that slide very well. So the national delivery model, so that regional support, as you can see, will look around the selection and enrolment for registrars. This is mainly how the programme runs, policy management, fellowship training. These are things that I've already covered in a couple of the slides. I'm just mindful of time, so I'll skip through some of these if that's okay.
Next slide.
Okay, so the regional team, as we've already introduced, Dr. Vimbai, Kapuya, Roberta here are training officers who will support the registrars, medical educators. Some of them are already working, in fact, they're all working currently in the Northern Territory, and you'll be familiar with the names here. We're currently under the recruitment for the practice support officers, which are the positions that I mentioned before, who will be those key people who will work with practices. As Gerard says, there's going to be new systems and new, unfamiliar territory when it comes to using those particular systems. So we're implementing some, I suppose, strategies for using those portals, and that will be also those rural practice support officers will be the people who will help to guide you through and support you through any new portals and systems. So we will have a practice, a partner portal, similar to RACGP, and that partner portal is where you will be able to see your practice profile. You'll be able to submit all of your documentation through that particular process. Thanks, Roberta. Next slide. All right, so college-led training. So overarching training policies, regional education for registrars, particularly for supervisors, is national and regional support, registrar placement, that we'll be able to work with the practices directly and how placements actually occurred in the Northern Territory. And I'm very aware that, there's a collaborative approach in many areas to the placement of registrars, and we want to maintain that, support it, and hopefully provide access to more registrars so that we get more people in the Northern Territory. The key things around, sorry, Roberta, I was just going to go back to, as Gerard laid out, the nationally consistent payments and flexible pool, which it was very clear that you are already aware of, is the tiered payment system. So that applies to both colleges. There's no difference. And we will have a flexible payment pool that can be accessed for additional support. So that's discretionary funding that can be applied for practices to retain and recruit registrars. We're actually finalising that, and that's been reviewed, and we've received feedback from GPRA and GPSA, who are very comfortable with ACRRM's approach. So we're just having that finalised through the department, and that should be published very soon. Thanks very much, Roberta.
So I can talk about accreditation. So the standards remain the same under college-led training. To continue to be a supervisor or training post, you need to meet the current training post standards. And where a practice wants to be accredited with both colleges, this is going to be managed collaboratively. So we recognise the accreditation of practices at the moment, however long their accreditation is for, we will honour and recognise that until they are needing to be re-accredited. Next slide, please. The supervision and teaching requirements are the same. So for core generalist training 1, it's 100%. For our independent pathway registrars, it's on an as-needs basis. And also the supervision requirements go down as the registrar works their way through their fellowship. In practice, teaching remains the same. It is a little bit different to the RACGP. We've got the 3 hours, the 1.5, and then the 45 minutes per week. And for the independent pathway, it's as is needed. Professional development, we will recognise professional development undertaken by supervisors regardless of which college they choose to do it with. We have on our web, up on our modules for supervisor orientation course. They're there, ready to go now and cover those topics. We will pay supervisors from the flexible payment pool that Sandra mentioned to attend professional development. And we're in the process of looking at regionally in the Northern Territory, what face-to-face workshops and webinars will look like for supervisors. So for practice support, you've got the local regional director of training, as Sandra has mentioned, and the rural practice support officers. We've got the supervisor liaison officers as well. We are going to offer online and face-to-face training and peer networking opportunities and forums. There is a rural practice support coordinator that is a national role. She is providing further support and she's also developing resources. One of the questions that came in was about the NTGPE cheat sheet. Debbie, our rural practice support coordinator, is actually in the process of developing a resource for supervisors and practices, and she is aware of the NTGPE cheat sheet. And then, of course, there's the national consistent payments that Gerard alluded to, and that's the same for both colleges. This is just information about, I'm just mindful of time, so this is information about accessing the national consistent payments, which is paid through Services Australia, and you need to set up a PRODA account and go through the motions of establishing yourself in order to receive those payments. And this is the payments which Gerard has already alluded to. So they're the same for ACRRRM as they are for RACGP. This is the education calendar for the registrars, because I know supervisors and practice managers are particularly keen to know when the registrars have to leave the practice and go out for their education. So we have mapped out the national and regional registrar education program for 2023. There's a combination of national online education, which is done across the whole country for consistency, and then each region will have face-to-face workshops following their 3 days of national education. And so this goes all the way through the year.
Roberta, can I just jump in there just to let everybody know? You're probably having a quick look at that calendar. It will be published. We will be publishing all of the education dates and an outline of that for the Northern Territory. So it will be available on our website very soon.
So the first one will be the orientation in Darwin on the 6th and 7th of February for the registrars who are going into their first community primary care term. And that will be 1 day orientation and 1 day cultural education. Can't hear you, Kaylee. Sandra, over to you.
Kaylee's just interrupting to give you a 3-minute warning.
Oh, okay, thanks. Thank you, Jenny. All right, Sandra, your turn.
Sorry, I'll be quick, Kaylee. All right, just to give you a quick update as to where we're up to. So we've developed a transition plan with NTGPE, and we've been working really closely with them over this period of time. And that transition plan is actually developed. It's actually just providing some key milestones as to where we're actually up to now, giving some timeframes and around the communications. And obviously, this is one of those communication opportunities where we get to talk to you directly, so you can ask us questions. And like was said earlier, yes, there'll be some road bumps along the way, but we are hoping to work through this process and have been with the best will in the world to make sure that it is very smooth and that we can continue you know, to address some of the concerns within the rural and remote communities and actually what's happening for you on the ground. So thanks, Roberta.
Next
slide. Okay, this is just a quick update to let you know where we're up to. We're into Q4 now, so we're busy transferring data. So we have all of the information around practices, supervisors. This is around your accreditation and which registrars you currently have, and making sure that you have your training agreements in place. We're going through the recruitment at the moment, as we said, for rural practice support officers and training officers in the Northern Territory. And NTGPE, as Gerard said, are currently working through the placement process for 2023. So you'll be engaging with them in that particular process. Thanks, Roberta. Next slide. All right. Just for your information, if you want to go onto the ACRRM website, this is where you'd find it. Just click onto the ACRRM website in college-led training. There's further information and details in there. And like I say, there'll be some updates coming. All right, there we go. Thanks very much, Kaylee. Hopefully you managed to do it in time.
Stan, can we unmute Kaylee's phone? So whilst we're waiting for Kaylee to hopefully get online there, I'd just like to thank both colleges for your presentations and for being so timely. Very impressive. And I think it does show that there has been a lot of work done between NTGPE and both RACGP and ACRRM over the last few years, and that's great to see that collaboration. I think that's heartening to all supervisors out there. We do have a few questions that we'd really like to pose, and I think we can probably do the stop sharing now so that I can actually see all the little tiles there. So one of the questions that had come in during the registration period was a question about the small group learning program. And I think Sandra and Roberta touched on this with their presentation, but supervisors are interested in what the difference is going to be between the colleges in small group learning requirements and times that practices are going to have to release them.
Well, I'm happy to answer that one from the RACGP. I mean, I think Roberta, ACRRM has pretty made that quite clear what their schedule. As someone who is both an RACGP and an ACRRM supervisor, I'm aware of this sort of challenge in your practice. It's suddenly previously, you just dealt with your one RTO, NTGPE, whereas now you will have registrars, or you may, if you're lucky to have a couple of registrars, you might have a registrar as an ACRRM and a registrar who's an RACGP. And in that circumstance, although there's many things which are the same and similar, particularly from the supervisor point of view, they will be offered separate out of practice activities. So by the small group learning, I think you mean the out of practice activities. The ACRRM, they've got their published calendar. As I said, my understanding was that Nigel Gray was speaking to James Brown earlier today and asking to make sure that we publish the RACGP's program for next year very soon. And pretty much, I think there's been a little bit of reticence because of concern about whether we'd have medical educators to deliver that program, but the RACGP is pretty much guaranteed you set that program, and if you don't have the MEs, we'll get MEs. We'll be very happy to come up and do some education up in the Northern Territory. There's a bit of a history of that for a few of us. We will definitely do that. So I expect that to be published soon. But that is the sort of thing. So if you're looking at what will be different rather than us all saying what will be the same, yeah, you'll have different management systems. It won't be just going to NTGPE. You will have to deal with one registrar through ACRRM system and another one through RACGP. That's the unfortunate part, I suppose, of how things have rolled out here.
Yes, no, thanks for that. So yeah, it'll be good to see those timetables when they are. But
pretty much, yeah. The message was deliver what you delivered last year, next year.
Excellent. Okay, and that I guess leads on to one of the other questions, that there was a keenness from some supervisors for a cheat sheet. This is similar to what has been provided by NTGPE over the last few years, where practices are given a 2-page handout of what to expect. Do you think that's going to appear for us soon?
Well,
Oh,
so
sorry.
Roberta, you go.
Jenny, as I just mentioned briefly, our Rural Practice Support Coordinator is developing a resource. I think it might even be a one-pager, but it might be two. And that's going to cover the requirements that the supervisors need, a bit like the NTGPE cheat sheet, but also cover some other things as well around the payments with links to resources and that sort of thing. So it is actually in development, and it will be piloted with some of our medical educators and supervisors and practice managers.
Yep.
Right.
And one of the things, Jenny, just to add to that, we would really appreciate feedback on that, because we want it to be a useful document, just as NTGPE has been. So we want to make sure that document's useful. So we'll pilot it and we'll put it out and publish it, but we would really appreciate feedback on that so we can improve on how that works for practices.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll have the same, but that'll be true. You'll have two cheat sheets. You'll have an ACRRM cheat sheet and an RACGP cheat. That's the truth of it going forward.
Okay, that's all right. If there are only 1 or 2 pages, I think we'll probably manage.
There will be. There's a lot of information already there. There's a supervisor a handbook. I mean, both colleges have got supervisor handbooks. Both there's an onboarding. I mean, it says ACRRM's got some great resources available on theirs. Website, RACGP, we've got, I'm in the middle of writing and finalising an onboarding module for, you know, what you need to do, how to use the system, how to get your payments, all that sort of stuff. Because currently that information, you're quite right, it is a little bit dispersed all over the place, and it'd be good to get it in one place where you can easily access and find it.
Fabulous. Now, a thorny question that came up both at registration and has come up a couple of times in the chat box this evening is the issue of our numbers of registrars in the Northern Territory, for over the last few years diminishing, but also particularly over the coming year. And that's obviously caused quite a lot of concern amongst a lot of supervisors. And I guess everyone's hoping for a magical answer, and there was also a question about, is there going to be possibility of people slotting in and out from other parts of Australia and hopefully falling in love with living in the NT? Would either of you like to talk to that?
I'm happy to jump in first, Jenny. It's Karin.
Yep, found you. Yep.
As the rural clinical lead, we've been looking at this for a while, and next year we will have a new lead medical educator that is going to be focused on developing our training pipeline. So particularly for rural, but not only for rural, and of course NT is going to be a central point of focus for us. We're really keen to direct and guide and incentivize and create an environment, the nation of choice. Sorry, my internet says it's unstable.
Yes, it was
Zoom,
just
Gremlins night. Can you hear me?
We can now. Yes, it seems once you turn the camera off, it's better.
Yeah, so I was just saying that we really want to create an environment where the NT becomes the destination of choice for registrars.
Yeah.
So Jenny, can I just, Karin, have you finished?
Yes, over to you.
Okay, I thought you might have just frozen again, sorry. Look, it's a really important point, Jenny, and something I think that's on the minds of a lot of stakeholders and organisations in the Northern Territory. I've been meeting with and engaging with and developing relationships with a broad range of them. I guess ACRRM is at the table for the Doctors for the NT medical workforce collaboration, working with those organisations to look strategically at what we need to do along the pipeline and for the pipeline to encourage trainees to be in the Northern Territory. Also, we'll be working with the NTPHN on the GPW, the General Practice Workforce Priorities Project. So I think at that strategic level, having some input and linkages with those organisations from medical students right through hopefully is going to make a difference. There's no quick fix though.
No.
One of the things,
Sandra, did you want to say anything?
Only something really, I suppose, practical is because of that, the boundaries, because it one being one organisation, that flexibility to be able to move a little bit more fluidly between different states. It can be, you know, facilitated and be streamlined a lot more for registrars who are wanting to take up an experience in the NT. And like I said before, hopefully fall in love with the Northern Territory and stay there, not just do a training term or not just spend, you know, and I suppose, like Roberta said, it's promoting the uniqueness of working in the Northern Territory. So making sure that we have the right people coming to the Northern Territory, you know, looking at what opportunities are available for them for advanced skills training in Aboriginal health. So making sure that we're providing good tailored support and the appropriate information, so the decisions that people are making are the right decisions, so that they can stay there and they can receive all of the training there. And then, like I say, remain after training. Like Roberta said, it's not a quick fix, but it is something that I'm sure everybody around on this screen is, you know, concerned about and thinking about that uniqueness. And how do we do that? So thank you.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. My mic decided to drop out on the computer even though it was working fine to start with, so I managed to get myself on my tiny little phone. But I'll move on to, there's a couple of more questions that came through today. So the next question was, will there be any changes for NTGPE former clinical and cultural education content for GP registrars? I think we probably discussed a little bit about the clinical education content. I think there probably will be some quite big changes for the clinical education content with the, you know, new workshop delivery and some more centralised delivery of that. Happy if you want to speak a bit more to that, but I think perhaps quite importantly about the cultural education content for the GP registrars in NTGPE.
I'm happy to jump in there briefly, Kaylee. This is an area where both colleges have been working jointly around a number of areas. We are trying to make sure and putting processes in place, for example, that we're not falling over each other and being sort of creating a burden for practices, for duly accredited practices, for example, and in the placement of registrars. But in the area of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health training and the delivery of the strategic plans, which NTGPE have been delivering in the Territory for a number of years, both colleges are approaching this jointly through a joint entity with the recruitment of cultural educators and with the support for cultural educators, cultural mentors, their support staff. There was a communique, I think, went out late this afternoon on this very subject. We all wanted this to be in place long time ago. There's been a lot of work going on in the background to get it to the stage it's now at. We need to employ, support and carry over and continue the delivery of cultural education, cultural awareness, cultural safety, the education linkages into the clinical education, and most importantly, the ongoing connection, relationships, the people who have been delivering this on the ground in the Territory. They're the objectives. We've got to make that happen. And both colleges are working together on it. So that's the long answer. The short answer is we don't want to see any change to the strategic plan delivery in 2023. What we do want to see is to have the time in 2023 for the right people to work through where to from here, and to provide that time to take it forward. That's all I can really add to that.
I don't think I can add much more to that, David. I think you've covered off around the, you know, the joint entity. But like David said, you know, the colleges are working together, not just in the Northern Territory, but in the other states, to make sure that we support what's already been, you know, really good programs in each of the states, which are culturally appropriate to that particular region. So again, content we don't want to change. If any changes come, it comes from the cultural educators and the cultural mentors about developing and changing that program. That's not something that we will do. We'll work in collaboration to make sure that if there's anything to be improved, we can work with them to do that. So the changes will come through, the cultural educators, not dictated to by the colleges.
Great. Thank you. And so the final question we had pre today was, will IHPT, and I'm not sure of this acronym, so someone from NTGPE may have to help me with this, along with remote placements, continue to be funded and remain a mandatory requirement for GP registrars in the NT?
So it's the Indigenous health training.
So I think there's two parts to the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kaylee, if I don't answer them both. So the mandatory requirement, which at the moment, so we call it our training location requirement, is a MM6 for 12 months or an MM7 for 6 months, is no longer in place and wasn't in place for the 2023 placement process. And the reason that it wasn't in place is that the colleges did say that they would support any policies that the RTOs had. However, we could not make someone undertake that training location requirement when NTGP was not going to be there in 2023. So we've gone through the first round and the final round of our placement process. The team's just doing some work on that today, actually, and then we'll go into our match place round. So that's the first one about that, and that includes the IHT training requirement as well. Insofar as I think the second part might be about, was there a question about will it be funded?
Yeah, so it was funded and remain a mandatory requirement, and as you mentioned, the mandatory part has been removed. But yes, the funding, I suppose, for the remote and IHPT placements.
So the funding is actually what we call IHT salary support. That's a Commonwealth funding that NTGP are simply the caretakers of, and we delegate and we're delegated authority by the department to distribute those funds based on the department's policy. They are in place for 2023 and into the future. But definitely the funding that you have received in 2020, because the NT does have some exemptions and exceptions to that policy in some areas. And I actually contacted the department today to confirm that those exemptions and exceptions will continue through the whole of 2023. So the levels of funding you receive now, as in the rates per hour, will continue in 2023. And that information will be handed over to the colleges as well to ensure that they're aware, because it's if you have a look at, when you have all that spare time that you have in your days, if you have a look at the nationally consistent payment framework, the IHT salary support is also paid through those methodologies as well. So it is important to actually sort of understand the NCP a bit so that you can get your appropriate payments. And the colleges will mark off the appropriate payments based on the registrar's training hours, etc., that's within the system. I hope that's answered it.
There's probably a similar vein to that, is a question of regarding, there has been a NTGPE and AMSANT partnership in place for strategic plan and a shared position. And the question is, will that position be continued?
Now, Jamina, I'm going to have to take that one on call and get back to you. The reason being is that what the joint venture will do is every RTO's strategy plans that were put in place for 2023 will be honoured by the joint venture in 2023. And I just need and I should know this off by heart, quite frankly, but I just need to check if that position is in NTGP's strategy plan or we funded it elsewhere. I do believe it's actually in our strategy plan though, but let me confirm that and get back to you.
Thanks, Christine. So one question actually that David posed to the supervisors really is wondering whether there'd been whether you'd all received your advice and guidance on registering with PRODA, because it's actually our week last week. And have you had any problems doing so? Because I certainly was on a webinar last night that suggested there are several supervisors and practice managers around the country that have had a bit of difficulty getting their PRODA HPOS to get ready. And so if you are having some difficulties, could you put that into the chat box? Or if it went smoothly and it's all sorted and you're just ready to roll, we'd like to know that too.
And Jenny, we, as ACRRRM and the RACGP have regular catch-ups with the Department of Health, and we can feedback on the ground feedback that we're getting in relation to any problems relating to registering for PRODA into those meetings. And there's also regular catch-ups through GPSA, where if we need to be having an avenue to get further guidance out, that can be done through that as well. So what we're hearing back, as you can probably imagine, is there's a huge volume of practices, supervisors, registrars that they're looking to have registered or register a PRODA account for this purpose, and the department are sort of looking at how many have actually registered. They've also got a helpline or something, or an email address. I'm sorry, I can't be precise about it. And at the moment, the department may not be seeing a big problem here. If there is a big problem, then we need to really start ramping it up and giving them some specifics on what those problems are.
So there is actually a question about a little bit more guidance on the PRODA registration. Would any of you like to give us a quick cheat sheet on how to do that?
I mean, is that something that we could send out? Perhaps they did ask if practices could. The question was, could practices? I don't know. I actually haven't done it myself either. So
I'm happy to speak to it as a practice owner and supervisor, and having sat in and listened to a bit the last few nights. So I think the first thing is to say, for most of you, you've already got a PRODA account. If you need to be registered on PRODA, to have a organisation registered on PRODA, not as an individual, your practice registered. But that's the first bit. And the second bit is you need to get that organisation onto HPOS, which is the thing called the organisation register. So you need to achieve those two things. That's all you need to do. I was busily typing into the chat box to say one of the things which I'm going to be advocating for with the department is they need to then write back to us and say, we can see that it's all correct. You're ready to go. The system's all right to go, because of course you think you've done it right, but you don't know. I don't want to have to wait until the first week of February or the last week of January to find out whether I've done it right. I'd like to know that I've done it in advance. So I think that's one of the things we'll be advocating for. That's fundamentally what you've got to do. There's a lot of confusion out there because they talk about how you can have your supervisors can be individually paid. Okay, so there is the capacity for supervisors to be paid directly rather than the teaching payment to go to the practice and then be distributed on. By and large, I don't think that will happen very often, and it's probably not wise for most practices to do unless you're really confident of doing it that way, because it's not going to be flexible. You're not going to be able to change, oh no, he's not able to teach this week, we don't want the money to go to him or to her this week. That's not going to be available. So I think in most practices, it'll be that it's really just the practice manager needs to set about going on the organisation register, getting their organisation registered and through PRODA and then into HPOS, those two steps. There are, if you follow the links from the GPSA page through to the help things, there's helpful videos. I'll pop them up in the chat in a second, a link to the videos which are available, modules on how to do it. Yeah, good. That's my take on it.
So one of the questions was, does every supervisor within the practice need to be registered?
Zero.
So you're saying no?
No, and not unless they want to be paid directly. If they're happy to be paid through the practice, don't do it. It's going to go wrong.
Yeah, and most of us have got a PROTA for everything else anyway.
We do anyway, yeah. But I think you'd have to be on PROTA or on HPOS. It's not just PROTA, it's going on to HPOS.
Okay.
Jenny and Kaylee, I just wanted to give 2 comments about some of the stuff we've discussed today. Can you hear me properly?
We can.
All right, so just one on the issue of placements to rural remote areas that were being, there was a concern about our MMM 6 and 7 places not having registrars. So I just wanted to remind everyone that ACRRRM rural remote placements is our bread and butter. And so it is actually a requirement for ACRRRM registrars to be placed in the MMM 4 to 7 for at least a year throughout their training. So we should see ACRRRM registrars still going to those areas, and hopefully they will help with the workforce need in those areas. The other thing I wanted to just talk about is there was a question about SGLs earlier. Just to give you an idea about the education program is going to be different. In NTGPE, there's an orientation, 2 workshops, and then there's the small group learnings, which we have been doing weekly. And then there's also some assessment prep, such as the stamps study groups and the practice stamps and some CBD support. Now, with the ACRRRM education program, it actually runs over 4 semesters, whereas our current NTGPE semester runs over 2 semesters for the education program. And within the new ACRRRM program, we've been running it for the independent pathway registrars for several years, and it's actually been developed and improved. And it's a really good program, acknowledging that a lot of the registrars are rural and remote, and they like to actually work quite independently at their own time. So we've got set structures as far as what we're covering in the curriculum, but there's a range of things that they can do, from case studies, case-based discussions, a lot of self-directed learning. We do have webinars, and there's also practice MCQs within each of the different topics that we have for every module runs for a few weeks at a time. And it's a really well-supported and great education program. There will also be that orientation and workshops, as Roberta mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint, where you have the online part, but you also have face-to-face. And we're also hoping to have some sort of regional education centers, acknowledging that there's sort of mini hubs within the territory. So like there's Alice Springs, Darwin, obviously, then there's Catherine, Tennant Creek, and Gove, and then trying to just get people together in those sort of areas. So we're hoping that we'll be working well with the supervisors to try and encourage these little hubs so that the registrars feel supported and they know each other and get to meet each other. And we're also hoping that supervisors will help us. If you're interested in teaching education, if you're interested in being part of the workshops, please do let us know, because we'd love to get you involved, and we want to just get the best experience for our registrars in the territory. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got a feeding baby as well who's wanting to try and put her hand on camera, at least at the moment, so apologies for that. I think I don't think there's any more sort of pertinent questions, unless there's anything anyone wanted to ask right now. I suppose speak now or forever hold your peace. But I think that it's been an excellent discussion. Apologies. An excellent discussion, and I'd like to thank ACRRM and RACGP very much for their time, and also the staff at NTGPE for being here. And thank you to all the supervisors for coming along tonight to listen. I think certainly if there's any more questions that you'd like us to, you know, that come along the way, then contact NTGPE or myself or ACRRM or RACGP directly. And I'm sure there'll be lots more sort of little questions that come up along the way. Again, thank you to everyone for attending tonight, and I think we'll wrap it up now.